Well, hello. My name is Angel Wood, and this is Crime of the Truest Kind. Hey everybody, it has been a minute. I took a fair amount of time away from this show to produce a music festival, a 9-night music festival. All told, it went really great. And here I am, back again, delivering the goods on all the true crime happenings. You know, as always, there's a lot of bananas news stories. And as I've been working on this episode, the Lori Vallow Daybell verdict came out. Guilty on all charges. It's truly unbelievable. You cannot truly believe that someone could be that absolutely stone cold. So rest in peace, JJ and Tylee and Tammy Daybell, and very likely her former husband, Charles Vallow. It's nuts. It's not a local news story, but it is a very big story. Thank you to Crime of the Truest Kind patrons, superstars Lisa McColgan, Rhiannon, and Heather. They are what I call my honorary show producers. There are things coming up. I have a couple of things in the works, one of which, yes, we're going to do a live stream after Mother's Day. I'm working on a live crime in-person event on the North Shore of Massachusetts. It'll be a weekend, most likely a Sunday. Today's episode is in observation of the 10th anniversary of the Boston Marathon bombing, April 15th, 2013, and the subsequent days. It was a very chaotic time. It was a very tense time in this area. In the second segment, I talked to my friend Dave Wedge, who has been a guest on the show. Dave is a New York Times bestselling author and journalist. He hosts a podcast and an award-winning former reporter for the Boston Herald. He's chased a lot of stories, including covering 9/11, the Station nightclub fire in Warwick, Rhode Island. He wrote about the Worcester warehouse fire. He wrote about the Wakefield massacre. A lot of stories that I have covered on Crime of the Truest Kind. He co-wrote Hunting Whitey, the inside story of the capture and killing of America's most wanted mob boss. We're talking about Whitey Bulger. He co-authored Riding with Evil, taking down the notorious pagan motorcycle gang. And he co-wrote Boston Strong, a city's triumph over tragedy. And material from his book with his co-author Casey Sherman was used for the movie Patriots Day that came out in 2016, starring Marky Mark Wahlberg. I still call him Marky Mark Wahlberg, and I probably always will. This is episode number 42, Chaos on the Streets of Boston. You can also include in that Cambridge and Watertown. The Boston Marathon bombing 10 years ago. Patriots Day is a Massachusetts holiday. It falls on the third Monday in April, often referred to as Marathon Monday by locals. It commemorates the battles of Lexington, Concord, and Menotomy, some of the first battles of the American Revolutionary War. Major events in the area include battle reenactments, the running of the Boston Marathon, and the Red Sox always have a morning home game. Now, the Boston Marathon has been run on Patriots Day every year since its inception in 1897, even during the World War years, except, though, in 2020 and 2021. 2020 Boston Marathon was canceled entirely because of COVID, and the 2021 Boston Marathon was rescheduled that year and happened on October 11th. The city is alive with throngs of fans and onlookers. About 500,000 people watch the marathon along its 26.2-mile route. That starts in Hopkinton. The Boston Marathon is the oldest marathon in America. It's very prestigious, and runners have to qualify. It is a much celebrated day in the city, and I have attended several myself. The area is packed, roads are closed, barriers are set up along the route, even the local subway stop along the race is closed down. Now there are several others accessible to onlookers. More than 26,000 runners participated in the 2013 Boston Marathon, marking the 117th running. About 5 hours into the race, a bomb exploded less than half a block from the finish line. Roughly 12 seconds later, a second bomb exploded some 600 feet from the first. Both were placed on the north side of Boylston Street among the throngs of fans, friends, and revelers. First responders sprung into action immediately. They turned the medical tent that was used to treat the runners into an emergency medical facility. More than 100 people with serious injuries were transported to area hospitals by any means possible. Ambulances, police cars, any vehicle available. It happened as local police and federal investigators had to survey a crime scene that covered 15 square blocks. April 15th, 2015, at around 2:50 p.m., 2 bombs exploded near that finish line of the Boston Marathon. The bombs exploded within 50 to 100 yards apart. The first bomb went off near the finish line at 671 Boylston Street. The second, said by an FBI agent to be 12 seconds apart, at 755 Boylston Street, in front of what was the Forum restaurant. The devices were small enough to fit in regular backpacks. 2 pressure cooker bombs, 2 reasonably advanced explosives, they came to learn. I say reasonably advanced because it came as a surprise to authorities when they learned who the culprits were. Not a more sophisticated operation or a terror cell. No. 2 lunk-headed men from Cambridge, by way of Chechnya, acting alone. The pressure cooker bombs were filled with nails and ball bearings to provide maximum damage. And the black powder that is widely used as a propellant in firearms and pyrotechnics and as a blasting agent for explosives rigged to shoot bits of shrapnel into bodies and cause serious injury and death. Investigators first believed the devices were triggered by kitchen timers, but subsequent evidence showed a remote device was used to trigger the bombs. One of the bombers, the living one, told investigators that he learned the technique from an article in Inspire magazine. That is an English language online magazine. It is difficult for me to wrap my head around this sort of propaganda, as it is believed to have influence on those motivated by radical interpretations of Islam and provides detailed bomb-making instruction. 3 people were killed as a direct result of the bomb blast on Boylston Street that day. Krystle Campbell, the 29-year-old restaurant manager from Medford, Massachusetts. She was a Medford High and UMass Boston grad. Krystle worked for many years as a manager with Jasper White Summer Shack in Cambridge, and later became a manager at Jimmy's Steer House in Arlington. She was killed by the first bomb. I remember there was a great deal of confusion surrounding Krystle's whereabouts immediately following. She was missing, and friends and relatives were searching for her. I recall seeing missing posters online in the hours after the bombings. We did learn that EMTs carried her badly injured body into a medical tent, where volunteer physicians would work urgently to save her. A doctor caring for her spoke about how they were struck by her beauty, her youth, and her bright blue eyeshadow. Krystle was gravely injured. She had multiple wounds, she was not breathing, and she was unconscious. Her hair was singed. She had a large 3rd-degree burn on her back and deep wounds to her legs, some as large as 10 inches. A pellet the size of a BB was embedded in her ear. Other BBs and metal fragments were found in the wounds that penetrated her muscles. Her clothes were riddled with BBs and debris from the bomb. Emergency medics gave her CPR, but the cardiac monitor showed her heart was not pumping blood. She wouldn't make it, and she died there in that medical tent, with great care being given to her by those volunteers. Krystle is remembered for her amazing smile, her infectious energy and enthusiasm, her great kindness, and that blue eyeshadow. Krystle Campbell would have turned 40 years old this year on May 3rd. I wish her friends and family got to celebrate with her. Her father, Bill Campbell, told Yahoo News that she had been waiting at the finish line to cheer on a friend who was running when the bombs went off. It was a tragic case of mistaken identity, as her family were initially told that Krystle had survived. It would be learned later that her best friend Karen McWaters, who was badly hurt and lost a leg, was believed to be Krystle at first. In the Netflix series American Manhunt, the Boston Marathon bombing, Karen talks about those moments. She talks about how she was handed a phone at the scene, and she just put it in her pocket. That phone was actually Krystle's phone. And it was, in her words, just chaos. Martin Richard was the 8-year-old Dorchester boy and the youngest among the victims. He was killed by the second blast. This little boy suffered major injuries to his torso and his limbs. Almost every part of his small body had an injury. Shrapnel, including small nails, plastic, pellets, and wood, punched through the boy's 69-pound body. He can be seen near the finish line, there to cheer on the runners. In the surveillance footage that the authorities used to try to learn who placed the bombs, you can see that one of the men responsible is in that footage. Martin's sister Jane was 7 at the time and lost her left leg below the knee. Their mother Denise needed surgery for a brain injury, while his dad Bill suffered shrapnel damage to his legs. Older brother Henry, 10 at the time, did not suffer physical injury on that day. And Henry's gone on to run 2 Boston marathons to date, raising money for the Martin Richard Foundation, founded by his family after his death, to promote sportsmanship, including kindness and peace. Martin is remembered in a story by activist Bobby Constantino, who explained a viral photo of Martin Richard that circulated in the days and weeks after his death, showing him with a handmade sign that read, "No more hurting people, peace." Martin's class was studying nonviolent protest. Constantino wrote that he stepped into Richard's second-grade classroom the year before Martin was killed, when he was marching from Boston to Sanford, Florida, to protest Trayvon Martin's death. Now, to offer some context, Trayvon Martin was 17 when he was killed on February 26, 2012, while visiting his father in Sanford, Florida. On February 27th, Trayvon Martin's father, Tracy Martin, filed a missing persons report saying that his son hadn't returned from the store that previous night. Police showed his father a picture taken from a crime scene, and he confirmed the person in the photo was his son Trayvon. A man named George Zimmerman admitted to shooting him in what he called self-defense. It is documented that he was a neighborhood watch captain in Sanford and called 911 to report a suspicious person in the neighborhood. And at the time, Zimmerman was instructed not to approach that person, and he did. Now, this is not an episode about Trayvon Martin, and there is so much to his story. There is a statue at Bridgewater University depicting Martin Richard holding this sign. His parents, Bill and Denise Richard, met at Bridgewater and graduated in 1993. The school dedicated the Martin Richard Institute for Social Justice for the Betterment of Others with many programs to help at-risk and marginalized children. Lingzi Lu was a 23-year-old Chinese graduate student studying at Boston University when she took in the race that afternoon at the finish line. She was incredibly ambitious and focused. In a statement issued by her family following her death, they shared that it had always been her dream to come to America to study. She fell in love with Boston, and she loved the new friends she made here and her professors at Boston University. She wanted to play a role in international business, specializing in applied mathematics, and she had worked very hard to reach her goals. Keeping the dream alive is the theme of the foundation her family created in her honor, and proceeds support causes Lingzi was passionate about, and also gives back to Boston. Lingzi Lu died from a very painful gaping leg wound caused by large chunks of shrapnel from that bomb. Shrapnel punched through her legs, leaving multiple wounds, including one that was 7 inches long. The medical examiner testified during her trial that her femoral artery in her left leg was essentially cut in half, causing her to bleed to death. A death that would not have been immediate, but relatively quickly, seconds to minutes. When Lingzi's body arrived for autopsy, 2 belts remained tied around her leg, where people, civilians most likely, made every attempt to stop her from bleeding out. The official tally that comes from the Boston Public Health Commission puts the number of people injured in the bombings at 264. The initial estimate of 282 was decreased after state health officials discovered they had double counted some patients who were transferred between hospitals. And the ages of the injured ranged from 2 to 71. Victims were treated for injuries at 27 hospitals around Boston. Injuries ranged from hearing loss to amputations. 17 people lost legs at the scene or by surgical amputation, including 2 patients who lost both legs. Now, survivors had varying degrees of injury, and because the bombs were placed on the ground, much of the impact was to the feet and legs of people near the sites of each blast. The Spaulding Rehabilitation Center in Charlestown opened on April 27, 2013, just 12 days after the marathon bombings. Spaulding treated 32 of the most severely injured survivors, those who suffered from burns, loss of limbs, and damage from shrapnel. 16 of those survivors treated had amputations, including Jeff Bowman, the man seen being wheeled from the scene by Carlos Arredondo, with both legs devastatingly injured. Jeff did not know he would survive. He was clearly in shock, devastated by what he witnessed. But Carlos picking him up gave him hope that maybe he might make it through it. Jeff Bowman did, and he went on to write a book called Stronger, which became a film starring Mark Wahlberg. I'm just kidding. It starred Jake Gyllenhaal. Mark Wahlberg is not the hero in every movie, although you would think so based on his movie roles. Mark does star in Patriots Day, the film based on the book called Boston Strong, written by Dave Wedge and Casey Sherman. I will talk to Dave about the 10-year anniversary in the second half of this episode. Carlos Arredondo would become known as Cowboy Hat Guy because of the hat he chose to bring to the marathon that day. It's a hat that his mother gave him. She sent it from their home in Costa Rica, where he is from, and he had planned to gift it to someone. He did give it to his friend, but that friend, as it's been reported, was not a hat guy. So he gave it back. Carlos was recognized for his heroism on that day in helping get Jeff Bowman to safety. Jeff Bowman is also a hero in the story, as he had his eyes on one of the bombers and was able to relay to the police from his hospital bed, "Bag, saw the guy, looked right at me." The last marathon survivor to complete their inpatient stay was discharged in late August 2013. And many survivors, including Jeff, continued on with Spaulding, receiving outpatient therapy for many years. In the hours that followed the bombings, authorities worked around the clock to identify who and why. We mostly knew the what: the homemade pressure cooker bombs made for maximum destruction. While no additional bombs were found on the marathon route, it was unclear whether more existed and if there were plans for further carnage. We simply did not know what we were dealing with. And as the hours passed, every specialist under the sun was pulled into the investigation. The work was painstaking. FBI agents watched the same short piece of video 400 times. They needed to construct a timeline of images, following possible suspects as they moved along the sidewalks. They worked to build a narrative out of a random jumble of pictures from thousands of different phones and cameras. And while analysts combed through videos frame by frame, poring over hours of footage from the blast areas, investigators appealed to the public, asking them to share any kind of information they had, be it sightings or photographs of the event. Oh, and people shared photos. Lots of them. By 2013, we all had cell phones. And sure enough, one dogged civilian called authorities about his photos from across the street, showing the finish line in the forum crowd, giving the agents another key perspective. The photo came from a man who said he couldn't get through to authorities for hours amid all the confusion, and he nearly gave up. His photo showed a man wearing a white baseball cap, standing near a black backpack that was placed on the ground behind where little Martin Richard was standing. The FBI's computer analysis response team, known as CART, saw the photo and realized that they had the key to breaking the case. The analysts were able to sync up surveillance footage from local businesses, watching it over and over and over. Believe it or not, Whiskey's on Boylston Street, a very popular bar to hang out and drink till you were silly, they definitely contributed. All 36 of its surveillance cameras were rolling that day. Whiskey's was a frequent target of lawsuits, and the owner took to having a video record of everything that happened in every square inch of the place. The general manager at the time, a woman named Becky, knew they would have footage, but her system recorded 24 hours at a time, and that time was running out. The entire area of Boylston Street was shut down to everyone and remained that way for about 8 days. She would not be able to get to the bar in time to turn the cameras off and save that footage, though she managed to get through to the Boston Police headquarters, where Lieutenant Detective Mike McCarthy, an aide to Superintendent William Evans, took the call. Manager Becky told him that they needed to get to Whiskey's as soon as possible. 2 officers scrambled to get to Whiskey's, disabled that surveillance system in time to preserve that day's recordings. All of this turned out to be very crucial in the investigation. And Becky from Whiskey's, another hero in this story. At the same time, Jeff Bowman was waking up from surgery, and he had an eyewitness account, having seen one of the men face to face. He was recovering in intensive care post-amputation surgery. That's when Jeff Bowman gave him that description that he saw the older brother, Tamerlan Tsarnaev, to the FBI. That became very instrumental in leading them to identify the 2 suspects. Jeff Bowman would later testify at the trial about how he locked eyes with the older brother and knew there was something odd about him. Now, there was a lot surrounding how soon the authorities should have released the identities of the bombing suspects. By a lot, I mean a great deal of disagreement among police investigators and FBI agents and those who are running the show. Some will say no, they needed definitive information. There are reports that a known tabloid-style newspaper was trying to get the jump on the actual IDs. More will say, had they released the images of the 2 men sooner, that maybe others who were hurt or killed would not have been. And we will get to that. Stand by. The bombings happened on a Monday, Marathon Monday. By Wednesday, they were sure they knew who was bomber number 2, White Hat. There were a fair amount of internet web sleuths back in 2013, and the conjecture on sites like Reddit was bananas. Spreading information about people from images of the crowds on Boylston Street and making wildly irresponsible conclusions about who the perpetrators might be. Sound familiar? Law enforcement officials debated whether to release the photos, weighing the risk of the suspects running or possibly staging another attack. Remember, we don't know how many there were, and we didn't know what their plans were. There was the very real concern of controlling the information from the media. Investigators did not want to risk the investigation by having news outlets share the images of the Tsarnaevs first. They feared chaos. In an already chaotic and time-sensitive case, they could see the news, helicopters, the internet sleuths, vigilantes, and citizen detectives mucking up the progress of the investigation and competing with the police to find the suspects first. The probability also existed that releasing the photos in the search for their identities could garner sympathy for wrongly suspected people after the New York Post had run a crowd photo of 2 local men with the headline that read, "Bagmen." Both men would go on to sue the New York Post for its much criticized decision to run a photo of 2 Boston area men on the cover of its Thursday, April 18th issue. 16-year-old Salahuddin Baroum and 24-year-old Yassine Zaimi were at the marathon that day and were holding bags in the picture. One had a backpack, the other a nylon bag. Neither had anything to do with the bombings. Learning about their photographs being on the cover of the New York Post struck massive amounts of fear in those 2 men. They would eventually reach a settlement with the New York Post, terms of which were not disclosed. President Obama was shown the photographs of the suspects by senior members of his national security team. Senior administration officials said that although the president was not asked to approve the release of the images by the FBI, he did offer a word of caution after viewing them. Be certain that these are the right suspects before you put the pictures out there. That is what he advised his national security team. Later that same day, Thursday, the FBI released the images of the 2 men they believe were responsible for the Boston Marathon bombing. FBI Special Agent in Charge, Richard Delorier, spoke to the public, asking them to view only its pictures and deem any other photos not credible or risk creating undue work for vital law enforcement resources, and stressed to the public that all information should be reported to 911 and official investigators. The FBI hoped to cut out the couch detectives and internet warriors with the explicit intent to protect public safety even as they search for the bombers. As investigators predicted, releasing the photos did generate new information. It also provoked the brothers, and they set out to continue their death and destruction. The brothers possessed a pellet gun and one real gun, a 9mm Ruger pistol that high school friend Steven Silva had given to the younger Tsarnaev. The night their photos were released, these Tsarnaev brothers were out looking for more weapons. At 10:48 p.m., the 2 were in Central Square in Cambridge and ambushed 27-year-old Wilmington High School graduate and MIT police officer Sean Collier in his car on campus. They shot him 6 times, brutally, including 3 times in the right hand in an attempt to get his service weapon. Despite these merciless attempts, they were unable to free the weapon from the holster because of its security locking system to prevent anyone from grabbing an officer's gun. A grad student was biking past and saw a man leaning inside Sean's vehicle. That MIT student would testify at the trial that it was the younger brother. Someone inside the building closest to the attack called campus police. They reported hearing what they called sharp, quick noises that sounded like someone hitting trash cans very hard. Police were on the scene in minutes, and it was utter chaos. I was a few blocks away that night, and there were emergency vehicles and helicopters flying overhead. We were made to stay inside the venue where we were for hours into the night. This entire scene was captured on an eerie, long-distance surveillance video shot from across a wide courtyard and more than 20 stories up on another MIT building. From there, the two headed out, possibly to locate more weapons. They planned a getaway, that we know. They fled Central Square in Cambridge and carjacked a man, Danny Meng, who testified that he took a ride in his Mercedes SUV to relax after a long day at work. He had pulled over to check his phone when the older brother tapped on his window. Danny said he rolled the window down to hear what he was saying, and he pulled out a gun. Danny said that the brother pulled a magazine out of the gun to show him there were actual bullets inside, saying, "Don't be stupid." For anyone, that would be a frightening scene. The brother followed up with the question, "Do you know about the Boston Marathon explosion? Do you know who did it? I did it, and I just killed a policeman in Cambridge." The two brothers drove around for a period of time with Danny Meng in the back. They took his credit card, and the younger brother is seen on ATM footage taking money from his account. About $800. He tried to get a second $800, but the machine rejected his request. But everything changed when they stopped for gas and snacks at the Shell gas station on Memorial Drive in Cambridge. That Shell is still there today, and I think about the events of that night every time I drive by it. Danny Meng found the courage to run. He ran across River Street to the other gas station, the Mobile, and begged the clerk there to call the police. And that he did. The recorded call is available, and the audio would be very difficult to share with you. Dun Meng is another hero in this story. He got up the guts to run, and in doing so, saved many more lives. Now, the subsequent police chase and the wild, Wild West shootout on the streets of Sleepy Watertown are historic. Utter chaos. One of the first responders, Officer Richard Donahue from Woburn, who went to the police academy with Sean Collier, was shot and seriously wounded. He survived, but not without a painful recovery. And Officer Donahue's life has been changed forever as a result of the events of that day. A few thousand local officers descended on the firefight in Watertown. The two men were taking on the police with the few weapons that they had. It went terribly for them. I spoke to author and journalist Dave Wedge. He's been a guest on the show before. Dave Wedge was on the scene in Watertown. He covered the Boston Marathon bombing for the Boston Herald. I talked to him about the 10th anniversary of the Boston Marathon bombing. I imagine you've been pretty busy, this being the 10-year anniversary of the marathon bombing.
Well, for me, it's like, my career was kind of bookended in news and daily news by two events, which was 9/11 and the Boston Marathon bombings. Mm-hmm. And, 9/11 was one of the first big stories that I got sent down to cover. I was sent down there that morning. And so I kind of throughout my career went through all those anniversaries, the 5-year, the 10-year was particularly tough for me with 9/11. I was just turning 40 around that time when the 10th anniversary happened. And, it was a lot. It hits you pretty hard. And I've talked to a lot of my marathon survivor friends, other people involved, some of the law enforcement folks and things like that. And, even the families of those who lost their lives. And a lot of them expressed similar sentiments. The 10-year was very hard for them. A lot of them checked out, didn't want to be involved in any of the ceremonies this time when they had done it the other years. It's just, There's something about 10 years that just kind of is very reflective. It can be, emotionally painful. And I think it is for a lot of people. And it was this time around, I believe.
Watching some of the families who were involved, particularly the Richard family, kids like that haven't let this happening define them as they grow. And, that's obviously a testament to their own family and things that they've been able to learn throughout. What have you been able to learn from some of these folks who have been willing to take part? I know one of the more featured, for lack of a better term, injured folks was Jeff Bowman, and he went on to write a book and take on a sort of celebrity that he was probably very unexpected for him. What, if anything, do you know about where he is post all of this 10 years later?
Well, I haven't talked to Jeff in quite some time. We actually became friends after the bombings. And you may remember when Casey and I wrote our book, Boston Strong, one of the elements of that book was a trip that we took to France with 100 of the survivors and their families. Mm. And we write about that in the book. We wrote about it in a piece for Esquire. Mm-hmm. Jeff was on that trip, and Carlos, the man in the cowboy hat.
Yeah.
So we got a front seat to those guys and their relationship. And I spent a lot of time with Jeff on that ship, listening to music and hanging out and partying in France. And he was dating his girlfriend at the time.
Yeah.
And they got married. I believe they've since been divorced, is my understanding. And, so I haven't talked to Jeff in a long time, but, certainly, he's one of the folks that I think about quite often with this because he lost so much. He lost both his legs. And with that comes a whole host of issues that I don't think I'm qualified to discuss. I don't think anyone is unless they've been through it. I also have become somewhat friendly with Celeste Corcoran, who's another double amputee. And I've done some panels with Jessica Kensky, who originally lost one leg, but then had to have her second leg amputated. So
I remember.
As we look back on 10 years, we have to think about, we talk about the 3 people that lost their lives at the bombing. People often don't talk about the amputees.
Right. And there were a lot of folks who were injured.
A lot. I think, they say 200 injured, another 500 suffered some sort of trauma from what happened down there. But, physical injuries, you're talking 200 people. But the levels of those 200 people injured is very varied. You have people like Jeff Bowman, that's called an injury. He lost both his legs. That's a little more than an injury. You have other people that just, had some cuts and scrapes. Not to take anything away from them. They dealt with extreme trauma as well. But as we folks who were not there think about it and how to support these people, if you do know them, reach out and say hello, because I know it matters to them that it's remembered. And I know that it matters to these people that they're thought about, and they don't want to, a lot of people don't want to define their life by the marathon bombings, but at the same time, it does never go away.
And every time I read about this, because it definitely, I wasn't directly involved. I'm a Bostonian. I saw it happening on TV. I saw the fallout of everything that happened in the subsequent days. I always learn something new when I'm reading about it. I didn't realize this until recently that Jeff, whom we were just talking about, helped identify the guys.
Yeah, that's a pretty incredible part of the story, and that was in our book. And what happened was Jeff was right next to Jokar Sarnaia, and when he was in the hospital, obviously heavily sedated, he was in his hospital bed, and he said, I believe he said it, or if he wrote it down. I think he wrote it down. I think he wrote "bag guy," and the cops were like, "What?" And he was like, "I saw the guy." And then he ended up giving them the first images of the bomber, and they did a sketch of him, and that sketch is very accurate. It looks a lot like Jokar Sarnaia, and a lot of the law enforcement folks we dealt with said that was a key piece of the case, as in its early moments. They at least knew what to start looking for, and when they were looking at those video images, they had that sketch, so they knew, and they saw, hey, maybe this is the guy. So
he really helped connect those dots for them in the very beginning.
He did. It also gave them a spot, an actual area where it happened, and obviously they knew where the bomb was, but now they know, okay, this guy was there. All right, who was next to this guy? Who was next to him? Who was next to him? Now they start going through that video. Another thing I think about a lot, Angel, and I know you're into the, forensic investigations and all that stuff that marks true crime. As I sit and think about that case in court and the book we wrote where we got under the hood with a lot of the investigation and then the movie we made, Patriots Day, and we worked with Pete Berg on that. And we went through several iterations of the script and we assisted with that. What I think about most is covering that trial and thinking in that moment, remember, I'm an old school reporter. Like when I started at the Boston Herald in 1999, we didn't have cell phones. We didn't have internet. It seems kind of crazy, but we didn't. We would walk out of the door and go into the police station and pull paper records in the court, pull the paper records and all that, and then find a payphone and call back to the newsroom. So when I saw that unfold, I remember thinking like, wow, this is where we are now. Like it was like watching a movie. Every single moment of that crime and the aftermath were caught on video.
Yes.
And when they did it during the trial, where, Casey Sherman, my co-author, and I sat through that trial, and it was like watching a narrative documentary where you saw every piece of the crime. And I remember thinking like, this is different now. Like now everyone gets caught. You are, your digital footprint is everywhere. And it's even more now, 10 years later. I mean, your phone pings everywhere you go. There's surveillance cameras on almost every home now. I just remember thinking that, the video was such a big piece of that. But it's funny that you mentioned, Jeff Bauman kind of started it with old school kind of sleuthing where he just had a description of the guy. And that's how the case started.
I'm not going to say we can't talk about the two men who are responsible for this, because obviously their story, the lead in to that day is pretty interesting about their background a bit. But I want to say this, it's very obvious that these two men had absolutely no idea what they were doing. They sort of, in the criminal sense, lucked out that everything worked the way they hoped it had. Because think about everything that happened. They're on Boylston Street. There are cameras everywhere. Even then, in 2013, they quickly identified them. I do want to talk about how Ed Davis wanted to release the photographs and the FBI didn't want to release the photographs. Subsequently, it turned out to be a pretty good idea, yeah?
We battled about that in the book as well and wrote about it extensively. I mean, there's a lot of different stories. And, but we, Ed Davis talked to us for the book, but we also talked to the FBI. We also talked to Boston Police. There was a lot of disagreement about when those pictures should have been released. There's other people that think that they should have been released even earlier. As you know, there's a lot of folks out there that believe that had the federal agents done their job better and identified them sooner, then Sean Collier would be alive.
Oh, yeah.
Police officer who was killed at MIT. And, some of the Boston police folks that we spoke with were incredulous that it took so long to identify them because Tamerlan Tsarnaev had traveled internationally. He had been on a watch list. He had been through the federal system. They had been through immigration. So their photos should have been somewhere. Someone should have known who they were before they had to publicly release those photos. And I'm not here to conspiracy theory or Monday morning armchair quarterback, but I'm just telling you from my reporting, there's a lot of folks out there that feel that the ball was dropped in that sense. When you talk about the two bombers who, I don't like to talk about them either. And Casey and I made a decision when we wrote the book that we weren't telling the story of the bad guys. We told enough so that you understood the context. Yep. But I'm not going to write the biography of those guys. Someone else can do that, and other people have. But I will say they definitely didn't plan well for not getting caught.
That's right.
But they planned well to maximize destruction and chaos and casualties. Those bombs were very well constructed. Remember, Tamerlan Tsarnaev went to a terrorist training camp in Chechnya. These guys were jihadists. They didn't care if they're no different than the 9/11 hijackers. They really didn't care if they died or lived or got caught or didn't get caught. I think Dzhokhar was a little too young and didn't realize the magnitude of what he was getting into. But the older brother certainly knew that this was his calling in life. This was what his purpose was, and that he was going to die doing it. And I don't think he had any problem with that. So that's scary that those kind of people are out there. And again, remember, they had 2 more pressure cooker bombs and then 6 homemade hand grenades, and they were headed for Times Square.
And that is another component to this that I think gets lost in the chaos of what happened that Thursday into Friday. I remember it very well. I was in Cambridge and Central Square that evening when Sean Collier got murdered. It was absolute chaos, and it just went from Cambridge, and it was like a wave. Certainly Boston on that Monday, Marathon Monday, and then everything that happened between then with authorities trying to track them down and identified them, and then they knew. They were like, well, we got to go for it because they're on to us. That's when they carjacked the man's car. That man is a hero, by the way. I don't think we talk about that enough.
Big time. It sure is.
He had the courage and foresight to say, I got to try to get out of this because, again, these stupid men identified themselves as to, we're the ones that did that at the marathon. It's us. So they ended up in Central Square, murdered Sean Collier because they were collecting weapons. They wanted his gun. They didn't get it. The poor man suffered greatly as a result of that. And then they got to Watertown, which you ended up going to. I know that. They were throwing pipe bombs at the police. There was all out chaos. Can you take us there and tell me about what you saw? When we say chaos, there were upwards of like 2,000 police officers from all over the region there.
Nothing like this had ever happened in an American city ever. You had things like Waco. We had standoffs. There's been some other things like that, but there had never been in an American city, terrorists on the loose with bombs that they were throwing at the police and guns, and the complete lack of information and knowledge on where they were going, what they were doing. Yeah. Was there a safe house? That was the first thing I thought. I got dispatched to the Sean Collier shooting in the middle of the night. And as I was on my way there, we heard on the police scanners the bombings and the shootings in Watertown. So I got diverted to the corner of Dexter and Laurel Street. That's my editor specifically said, go to the corner of Dexter and Laurel Street. So that's where I went. My first thought when I was pulling into that neighborhood was, there's got to be a safe house here. These guys were terrorists. We knew that. So I was thinking maybe there's 20 of them. Thinking 9/11 hijackers. Maybe there's 20 of them and they have more bombs. They're going to go do some other, destruction. So no one knew. I pull up and there's just people running all over the place, police everywhere, guns out. The thing is the bars were emptying out at that time in that neighborhood. And so there's a bunch of young kids, college students and, 20-somethings walking home. And it was a little chilly and they're all wearing hoodies and they're all, got backpacks, every one of them. Normal attire, and the cops just tackled every single one of them and searched them. And I feel bad for those kids that got caught up in that, but no one knew what was going on. It was literally like, I think about these things. You make a good point. It was like a wave, and that's what happened on 9/11. The same thing. It's like, plane hit the World Trade Center. Another plane hit the World Trade Center. Another one just hit the Pentagon. Another one just crashed in a field in Pennsylvania. So now the whole world is thinking like, what's next? And is there a train bombing coming? There's more planes. It was the same thing with Watertown and the marathon. It's like, where does it end? And so it was very unsettling. Long story short, my car ended up inside the crime scene, so I couldn't leave. I wasn't leaving anyway. I was out there in an unfolding news story. There was a few reporters out there. There weren't too many of us. There was probably maybe 5 or 6 of us out there at the scene. And they, the Herald kept me there overnight. Until they caught him the next day. And, that night, just to see and the level of law enforcement that was in that neighborhood, there was giant armored cars and trucks from all sorts of different departments and agencies. And, us reporters would be behind the police tape and you're in those stakeouts and you're chit-chatting about everything. You're not necessarily talking about what's going on. You're trying not to probably share information. We're just kind of casually hanging out, waiting for the next event, I guess. And, suddenly the Army National Guard would come over and scream at us and say, get back. And they'd move us back, push us back a block or two. They would go into the house that we were just standing in front of with their guns drawn and the dogs and searching house to house. So you're thinking, were they just in the house we were standing in front of and we didn't know that? You just don't know. It's just a real feeling of uncertainty. Long story short, eventually, the shootout happened at Dave Henneberry's boat. We made it over to there and they caught the guy.
That's not without its own controversies, of course, because the younger brother reportedly got in the car to escape and backed over the older brother who was injured and dragged him, quite possibly killing his own brother, took off and then went into hiding, and we shut the city down. And when we say we shut the city down, I live north of Boston. None of us went anywhere. I had events that were canceled. We got nationally and probably internationally, the city of Boston got a whole lot of shit for our shelter in place. I don't remember anybody, and I'm sure they existed, but I don't remember a whole lot of people saying we shouldn't have done that because we were pissed off and we wanted to catch those fuckers.
Yeah, I would agree with you, Angel. I think it's, again, Monday morning quarterbacking. It's easy for you to say it wasn't your city that just got ripped apart by bombs and an 8-year-old boy was murdered on the street and a cop was killed just sitting in his car minding his own business, and they tried to steal his gun, and now a suburban neighborhood has become a war zone. And make no mistake about it, that's what that was. That was a war that happened out there. There was, it's funny, we just did a 10-year anniversary. We did a screening of Patriots Day, and we were with Joe Rogers, who's Sean Collier's dad, and John McClellan, who was one of the Watertown officers in the middle of that firefight. Him and I were talking, and he was like, we go over it all the time. He speaks at law enforcement conferences, and he's like, none of us can believe that there was no civilian casualties.
And there were bullets flying into people's homes. Make no mistake.
People came outside. There was, hundreds of rounds flying around that neighborhood. Yeah. And, what John McClellan said to me, he said, if that happens, 10 times, 9 times someone's killed. Someone else would kill. And you did have DJ Simmons, who was hurt by a bomb and later died of injuries connected to that incident. But, and Dick Donahue obviously nearly almost lost his life. He was an MBTA officer that was shot, friendly fire, took a bullet and almost bled out and died, changed his life. He's never been able to work again. It is a miracle that, a bullet didn't go through a house and kill someone that was just sitting in their living room, or that, another car didn't drive by and wasn't shot up. So I think, it's easy for people that hate authority and hate the establishment to say, who are you to lock down, tell us we can't leave our house. That's great. But how would it have been if they didn't put us in shelter in place and there was a terror cell that was activated and 15 kids are murdered? I don't like government overreach either, but there's certain situations that happen that the government has to do its job, which is protect the people. I feel that way about 9/11, increasing airport security after 9/11. A lot of people didn't like that, the imposition on personal freedoms. And I'm not saying I'm happy about it either, but if it comes between protecting people from being killed by terrorists and people being inconvenienced, I'll choose the latter.
At that point, we knew there was someone still at large.
Exactly.
We didn't know anything about that kid. Let's say he was a 19-year-old kid at the time, but he had proven to us at that point that he was willing to kill.
Right. Yeah, threw bombs at the police. He blew up the Boston Marathon. What more do you need to decide to? Governor Patrick absolutely made the right call, and Mayor Menino. I'd like to think that if it happened today, they'd do the same thing, but I don't know. I don't know.
And it lifted pretty quickly into Friday. I don't recall what time of the day that Friday that they lifted it, but right after they lifted it, just about right after, we heard that a man in the neighborhood saw something. His boat was wrapped in his yard. There's this white sort of plastic type stuff that they use to wrap boats. And the man in the neighborhood saw something wasn't right and went over and peeked inside and said, someone's in my boat. Someone's in my boat. And that's when another level of hell broke out. And everyone, every law enforcement person, organization just went for it. we've talked about this, how there was just bullets flying because it was a chaos again.
Yeah, it was nuts. It was, hundreds of bullets were fired. And, the funny part about, the shelter in place controversy, quote unquote, is it worked. That kid became a prisoner in that neighborhood. He couldn't go anywhere because, the neighborhood was surrounded. But the funny part is they set up a 20-block perimeter to look for him. And where he actually was like on block 21. He was like on the next block out from it. And as soon as they lifted the shelter in place, the boat owner, Dave Henneberry, is a smoker. He passed away a couple of years ago.
Yeah, he came out to smoke a butt.
Went outside to have a cigarette. And that's why he was out there. And he noticed that the boat, he saw blood on the tarp. And he looked in and he saw the kid and he called 911 and they came in. The shootout happened. And again, John McClellan talked to me about that the other night. Just said that it's absolutely ridiculous that no officers were killed during that shootout at the boat. There were so many bullets flying and so many agencies are all in different radio channels. There was no communication network. It was pretty insane what happened out there. But at the end, they got the kid, they pulled him out of the boat, put him in custody. He's found guilty and got the death penalty. He's appealing it, and he's out in the Supermax in Florence, Colorado, where he belongs.
Do you think that in our lifetime, this kid will see the death penalty, or in his lifetime?
That's a good question. I mean, 10 years ago, they said, if the death penalty, it's a 20-year process, usually, because that's what it takes to go through all the appeals. You exhaust the appeals. They always do a final attempt at a governor's pardon, that sort of thing. I'm not a death penalty person. I don't really think it's the right thing that we should be doing as a society. I think, prison is a pretty awful punishment, solitary confinement, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But, that's the law we have. So, I hope the wheels of justice go through, and I hope he has his day in court. And if that's the finding and all the appeals are rejected, then, I would say another 10 years, he probably will get executed.
What is the consensus among the families directly affected by the events of those days?
Well, it's funny. There isn't one. They had a lot of different opinions. The Richard family, Martin Richard's father, Bill, famously came out against the death penalty, and some of the other victims did as well on, philosophical basis. They're just like, they don't believe in government-sponsored executions. They think it's, thou shalt not kill. A lot of people live by that, and they take it seriously. There's others that I know that are like apathetic about it. Like, they don't care what happens to him. They don't care if he lives or dies. They don't really want. I think the biggest thing is most of them don't want to hear about it anymore.
They don't want to think about it anymore.
Yeah. They don't want to think about him. They don't want to see his picture. They don't want to see him on the news. And that's the problem with the death penalty, is it lingers on forever and it keeps the case alive and it becomes a cause celeb for people. We've seen that before, where horrible serial killers become a cause celeb for social justice folks. And I think it's admirable that those people are out there and are fighting for human rights, no matter how bad the person is. But there is consequences, in the form of emotional re-victimization for some of these people that were involved in the tragedy. So all I can say is I hope whatever happens, that it doesn't go on forever.
I mean, he's pretty young. Where is he? He's not even 30 years old right now, right? Yeah. So he's got a long time to sit in that prison cell and play victim.
It's an awful existence. I mean, people, the Supermax is not a nice, it's hell on earth. It's catacombs, and
yeah.
I read somewhere that he had like a radio or something in his cell, and that's about it. But, he doesn't interact with other people. He's not out in the general population, and his only interaction with humanity is with the CEO that brings him his food.
Yeah, and he has a lot of time to think about all the things that he should not have done. What is your feeling? I know that this has been a big part of your reporting and, your subsequent books. It seems pretty obvious to us that his older brother had quite amount of influence on him at his young age of, 18, 19 at the time. It's hard for me to imagine, but I don't know, you know more about these people than I do. It's hard for me to imagine that an 18 or a 19-year-old kid that pretty much had everything going for him. He was he was in college, he had friends, he had his whole life ahead of him. It's hard for me to imagine that he would have thought about these sort of things on his own? Was he angry enough at that age to think about this stuff on his own, or was he just so heavily influenced by the older brother?
Casey and I talk about this a lot when we speak about this case, is that, the real villain here is the brothers, but the mother is also a very bad actor here. The mother who fled back to Chechnya immediately after the bombings.
She's defended them, right?
Yeah, she's defended them. But she poisoned Tamerlane's mind with, extremism. Tamerlane bought into it hook, line, and sinker. The whole, jihadist stuff. Like I said, he went to a terror training camp in Chechnya, and it's just radical extremism, like we see on both sides of the political spectrum these days. It's violence to advance an agenda, and we saw what the younger brother wrote in the boat. He wrote anti-American things that, you kill us, we kill you, that sort of stuff. The same stuff that happens in terrorism and wars all over the world. In their mind, they were part of a war. They were part of a cause. And I think that the younger brother certainly, that was his defense at his trial, was that his older brother made him do it. But there were many things that his older brother didn't make him do that he did, like search on the internet for all sorts of how to make a bomb, things like that. Also, he's the one that got the gun. He got the gun from his friend, the gun that Tamerlane used in that shootout. That was a gun that Dzhokhar acquired. He's 19. He wasn't 12, So 19, yeah, you're impressionable, of course. Your older brother, you're scared of him. His older brother was a monster, by the way. He was a very tough, strong, athletic dude that would kick the crap out of Dzhokhar at the drop of a hat. He's scared physically. He's threatened by the guy. There is an element I was once a 19-year-old college kid, and you're confused and you don't know what's going on in your life. And when I was that age, the Iraq War started, and some of my friends went off to war. So I was very angry. I was angry at George Bush. I was angry at the world for having a war. It felt like Vietnam, and my friends are going to fight and they're going to get killed. I'm sure that there's an element of that with this kid that, he's a Muslim and he sees the anti-Muslim sentiments around the world. He's angry. His friends are victims of prejudice. His family felt that they were victims of anti-Muslim sentiments from around the world. I can understand that, but to take that next step to act and to inflict violence, and to me, the most damning evidence and the most powerful evidence in this case was that video of Dzhokhar putting the bomb behind the Richard family, and he stood there for 4 minutes. And they played that whole 4-minute video in the courtroom during the death penalty phase. And that's what sealed the deal, because he had 4 minutes to change his mind. And you see Martin Richard and Jane Richard and the little kids right in front of him, and you see him put the backpack down, and he stays there and he waits. And then he hears the other bomb, and then he walks away, and then he sets the bomb off. Yeah. So he had plenty of time to think about it, and he chose the wrong thing to do.
Based on the information that we've, been able to read and research after all of this, it was reported that the CIA, the Department of Justice, Homeland Security, all these organizations were tipped off to the fact that these Tsarnaev folks were radicalized. We know that Tamerlan Tsarnaev, the older brother in this story, was radicalized. We know that he was on this list. We know that they were aware of his involvements, yet they cleared him. Now, in hindsight, certainly I don't think any government organization on this level would be like, we made a mistake, but they made a mistake.
I haven't followed that part of the story as closely as others have. I do know all the things you just said are true, and I know that he was on a watch list and he was cleared, but, there's thousands of people on those watch lists. I do know that organizations, federal agencies do track the purchases of people on those watch lists. They just didn't seem to raise the red flags that would have been needed for the government to intervene. I'm also not a fan of the government intervening in people's lives without really, really good reason. I don't want to see people harassed just who have different beliefs or maybe express even radical beliefs. You're free to have radical beliefs in this country and not be subject to government surveillance. So I'm not 100% sure on that, but I do know that certainly there should have been a lot more follow-up on the Waltham murders. Tamerlan Tsarnaev, for your listeners that don't know, should have been a suspect in the murder of 3 men in Waltham that he killed a few years earlier, and there was just
on September 11th, 2011.
Right. There was no real investigation into that.
at all.
At all. And so I think that was really the missed opportunity to catch Tamerlan and stop this thing. The wheels should have been taken off a long time before.
I remember listening to your podcast that you and Casey do, Saints, Sinners, and Serial Killers, and you talk at length about that. Are you of the belief that Tamerlan is responsible for those murders?
Yeah, I mean, I think the evidence has been pretty clear, and I think it's undisputed that he did it. I'd have to go back and look at some of this reporting that we did, but everyone pretty much agrees that he was the killer in that. And the reason why was it was drugs, and these were kids that he knew, and he was clearly there, and he was never questioned, and everybody knew that he was there, and they never even questioned him. So that murder always sat very poorly with me, and there's been a book written about the whole Waltham murders by our friend Michelle McPhee. I think there's a lot out there if people want to know more about that.
I was aware of the fact that he was suspected, but I never had really delved deep enough into it to recognize that, there's a lot of people that believe he is the person who murdered those men, who were friends. He didn't go to their funeral. Such a good friend. Didn't attend any of the services for the people he was close to. So it's all suspect.
The biggest thing was it wasn't a robbery. It was, he took their weed, killed them, stabbed them to death, and sprinkled the weed all over them. It was a message that, they were doing the wrong thing. They were not adhering to the values that they should adhere to, in his opinion. So there was a lot of missed opportunities in this case. But again, Monday morning quarterbacking, I think the same thing can be said about 9/11. The same thing can be said about a lot of these school shootings that we experience. That's why people do need to be vigilant in their life. If someone is giving out red flags or signals, you do need to talk to someone that you trust, that, you don't want to go calling 911 every day, but talk to someone. Hey, this is kind of weird. Do you think we should do something about it? Because that's how these things are stopped. Yeah. It's stopped by someone speaking up to the right person at the right time. And a lot of times it saves people's lives.
It absolutely does. And no one knows these things better than someone like you who's been a reporter in the front lines watching these things go down. The 9/11 story is an incredible one that I can't ever seem to stop reading about it. When we hear that term, never forget, same thing with our neighbors and friends on Marathon Monday and the subsequent days. I never want to forget that. I never want to forget what happened, because I need to continue to be a compassionate and feeling person. Same thing with any trauma that happens in the news, shootings, etc. We cannot be a discompassionate society who just says, that's just the way it is. I refuse to do that. I refuse to be that kind of person who just doesn't ever want to be affected by anything ever again.
For me, it's like all these things, it's like watching a bad movie sometimes to me. It's like these things happen, and I've covered so many murders and so many tragedies and accidents and terrorism and all of it, that every time when it happens, I'm like, all right, this is going to come out, this is going to come out, this is going to come out. I can see it coming, and we'll never stop learning about what happened on 9/11. Right. There's always going to be new stuff that's going to come out as time marches on. And I feel the same with the Boston Marathon. There'll be more stuff that we'll learn as time goes on. And I think that's important. We have to continue to learn from these things. Just like, we still don't really know the whole story with the JFK assassination or the Martin Luther King assassination. Like these moments in history, there's always more to the story. And for me as a journalist, it's important to continue to report that stuff when it does come out, if I'm in a position to do so. And I hope others do as well, because the best way to improve the future is to learn from the past. That's my opinion.
That's right. Well, thank you, Dave Wedge. What's next for you?
Books, movies, documentaries. We're trying to make my latest book, Riding with Evil, about the only police officer to ever infiltrate the Pagans motorcycle gang, very violent biker gang, rivals of the Hells Angels. I wrote the story with him. His name's Ken Croak, and we're working on some movie opportunities right now on that. So we're in the middle of pitch calls as we speak, actually. So it's exciting, fingers crossed. And then, I'm kind of looking out for my next book. I have a couple things in the works. Might be doing a documentary. I might be doing something on the Africa Bambaataa case.
Oh.
I think you remember that one. We may have talked about that in the past. So got a lot going on.
I always give you and Casey all the love for hunting Whitey. I thought that was so excellent and so well done. It was one of the reasons why I started this podcast in the first place, because I was so affected by it. It was just so great.
Oh, that makes me happy. And I guess I kind of buried the lead there. I forgot we're performing Hunting Whitey live at the Wilbur Theater on May 16th. Neil McDonough is starring as Whitey Bulger. Neil from American Horror Story and Yellowstone and Band of Brothers. Great actor, born in Dorchester, raised on the Cape. We sold it out in like 2 hours once Neil was announced as the star. So that's going to be a really epic night.
Of course, I love Casey's book, Helltown, which
Yeah.
I read over the summer, and I want to talk to him about that too.
Listen, we love what you do. We love that, you dig into a lot of these crimes that we've covered in our lives and others that we haven't. I think, local news coverage is so important, and, you do a great job, and thanks for having me on anytime.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you, friend Dave Wedge, author and journalist. I will give you a rundown of relevant suggested reading and viewing at the end of the show. Tamerlan Tsarnaev died on April 19th, 2013. His death certificate lists gunshot wounds and blunt trauma as the cause. It is confirmed that he was struck and dragged by a vehicle driven by his brother. I believe his brother killed him. The older Tsarnaev was 26 years old when he died. He had a wife and a daughter at the time of his death. The wife was not charged, though she reportedly made many strange Google searches and statements before and following the bombings on Boylston Street. The younger Tsarnaev was captured in a chaotic shootout in Watertown. Resident David Henneberry came out to have a smoke after the shelter-in-place order was lifted. Saw that his boat that he had stored for the winter in his backyard was disrupted and discovered someone was hiding inside. He notified authorities who would descend by the droves. He was in there, in the fetal position, very likely bleeding to death himself. The younger brother would surrender after a 2-hour standoff that many of us listened to over the scanner. The trial of Dzhokhar Tsarnaev began on March 4th, 2015 in Boston. After more than a month-long trial, he was found guilty on all 30 counts of the indictment. On April 8th, 2015, nearly 2 years after the bombings, the charges of usage of a weapon of mass destruction resulting in death, in addition to aiding and abetting, made Tsarnaev eligible for the death penalty. In December 2018, his lawyers filed an appeal on several grounds, including jurors being affected by biased media coverage, as they called it. In July 2020, the appeal was upheld by the United States Court of Appeals for the First Circuit, vacating the death sentence. In March of 2022, the U.S. Supreme Court upholds his death sentence in a 6-3 ruling. And once again, in January of 2023, attorneys for the surviving Boston Marathon bomber have again requested that his death sentence be vacated, this time over juror misconduct claims. One claim is that a juror did not comment on the case, though retweeted a post calling Tsarnaev a piece of garbage. His release date simply lists death sentence. He's 29 years old, and he will never be released from prison. He will never see freedom. And it is very likely it will be a number of years before he faces execution. For all of the survivors, they are living their lives one day and one step at a time. Recommended listening: Saints, Sinners, and Serial Killers, the podcast hosted by Dave Wedge and Casey Sherman. Recommended reading: Boston Strong, A City's Triumph Over Tragedy by Dave Wedge and Casey Sherman. You can watch Patriots Day, starring Marky Mark Wahlberg. Dave Wedge cited Michelle McPhee's book, mayhem, unanswered questions about the Tsarnaev brothers in the U.S. government and the Boston Marathon bombing. That goes into great detail about the murders that we touched on September 11th, 2011. 3 men were murdered in Waltham, Massachusetts. It is now believed that Tamerlan Tsarnaev is responsible for those murders. There is a 3-part Hulu series about the Waltham triple murders called Murders Before the Marathon that I'm going to watch, and I'm going to add to your recommended viewing surrounding this case. And, of course, the new Netflix series, American Manhunt, the Boston Marathon bombing. All of this info will be linked on the show notes and at crimeofthetruestkind.com. Thank you for listening. I never enter into any of this subject matter in a lighthearted fashion. I knew there would be a lot of information. And there's actually much more. We could talk quite a lot about those Waltham murders in 2011. We will get to that in a future episode of Crime of the Truest Kind. My name is Angel Wood. Thank you for listening. Everything is linked at crimeofthetruestkind.com. Follow online at Crime of the Truest Kind. Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, and reach out to the show. Your show ideas are fantastic. crimeofthetruestkind@gmail.com. Thank you, Dave Wedge. Music appears in this episode by Joe Only One Kowalski and Andrew King. That does it for episode 42. Lock your goddamn doors.